right. So today we're diving into all these articles about PEPFAR and,
PEPFAR.
yeah, President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, when I first saw that title, I was like, oh, great. Another kind of boring policy thing. But
Right.
this is a fascinating program. And honestly, it has a really interesting history.
It really does. I think one of the most fascinating things about it is how it came to be. It was started in 2003 by President George W. Bush.
A Republican?
A Republican to combat HIV and AIDS globally. And, that's not something you see very often, this kind of bold action across party lines.
Yeah, especially with a health crisis that was and still is so stigmatized.
Absolutely.
I was thinking about the political climate even back then. It's kind of mind-blowing that this happened.
It is.
But the numbers were just impossible to ignore at that time. HIV/AIDS was a global emergency.
Yeah.
Millions of new infections and deaths every year.
Yeah, and PEPFAR primarily focused on Africa, where the epidemic was hitting the hardest. And it wasn't just about throwing money at the problem,
Yeah.
It was designed to work with local organizations, supporting them in distributing HIV medication and providing education on prevention and treatment.
Okay, so did that approach actually work? I mean, from what I've been reading, it sounds like PEPFAR has had a pretty remarkable impact.
Yeah, it really has. The numbers speak for themselves. It's estimated to have saved 25 million lives.
Wow.
Which is essentially the entire population of Texas.
That's incredible.
And it's not just about the lives saved, it's about the families and the communities that have been kept intact as a result.
That's a massive impact.
Yeah.
It's hard to even wrap your head around a number that big. I mean,
Yeah.
Are there any stories from the source material that really illustrate the human side of that success?
There are. Yeah, there's a really powerful account from a doctor in rural South Africa who talks about how before PEPFAR, he had no choice but to send patients home to die because there just wasn't any treatment available. Can you imagine having to tell someone that? But with PEPFAR, everything changed. He was able to offer his patients hope, a chance at a future.
That must have been incredible for both him and his patients. I mean, what a shift.
Yeah.
But, I'm noticing a theme in these articles. It seems like despite these undeniable successes, PEPFAR's future is far from secure.
You're right. That's the other side of the PEPFAR story, and that's where things get a little complicated. Despite saving millions of lives and receiving bipartisan support for years, the program is now facing some serious political roadblocks.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where is this pushback coming from and what are their concerns?
Well, a lot of the current controversy seems to stem from a 2023 report by the Heritage Foundation,
Which is
a conservative think tank.
okay.
And they accuse PEPFAR of promoting radical gender ideology and even more seriously, violating the Helms Amendment.
Hold on, I need a quick refresher on the Helms Amendment. What does that entail exactly?
So it's a U.S. law from the 1970s that prohibits using U.S. funds for abortions abroad. So essentially, the Heritage Foundation is alleging that PEPFAR funds are indirectly supporting abortions, which would be a direct violation of that amendment.
And what evidence do they have for that claim? It sounds pretty serious.
Well, their main focus is an incident in Mozambique where it was alleged that PEPFAR funds were indeed used for abortions.
Okay.
It caused quite a stir, and ultimately Mozambique ended up refunding the money to the U.S. after an investigation.
So the issue was resolved. It's interesting that this one incident in Mozambique is being used to cast doubt on the entire program.
Exactly. The Mozambique incident, while ultimately resolved, fueled a broader debate about PEPFAR's funding practices and ignited criticism from some conservative lawmakers.
Yeah.
And it doesn't stop there. There are other criticisms being leveled at the program as well.
Like what I'm seeing, mentions of abstinence-only education and needle exchange programs. What's the story there?
So those are two of the most contentious points. In the early days of PEPFAR, organizations receiving funding were required to promote abstinence as the primary method of HIV prevention. This abstinence-only approach has been criticized by many public health experts who argue that it's not only ineffective but potentially harmful because it fails to provide young people with the information they need to make informed decisions about their sexual health and actually increases stigma and shame around sex and sexuality.
Trying to impose a one-size-fits-all approach to something as complex as human behavior, especially in such diverse cultural contexts? Yeah, that seems like it would be a recipe for disaster.
A recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
And then there's the issue of needle exchange programs.
Okay.
PEPFAR currently has a ban on funding these programs, which aim to reduce HIV transmission among people who inject drugs by providing them with clean needles.
I could see how that would be controversial.
Yeah.
But isn't there evidence that needle exchange programs actually work?
There is. Numerous studies have shown that these programs are highly effective in preventing HIV and other bloodborne infections. They also provide a point of contact for people who inject drugs, connecting them with healthcare and social services. But opponents of these programs argue that they condone drug use and don't actually reduce HIV transmission.
So it's another case of public health best practices clashing with political ideologies. And it seems like this clash came to a head in 2025 with President Trump's decision to temporarily halt PEPFAR funding as part of a broader freeze on foreign aid.
That's right. The 90-day pause, as it was called, sent shockwaves through the global health community. Organizations working on the ground were suddenly ordered to halt the distribution of HIV medication, even if they already had supplies on hand.
Wow.
Appointments were canceled, patients were left in limbo, unsure if they would be able to continue their treatment.
That's incredibly disruptive. What were the immediate consequences of this pause? I imagine that must have been a chaotic and frightening time for those who rely on PEPFAR for their survival.
The consequences were significant both on an individual and a global scale. Interrupting HIV treatment can be incredibly dangerous because the virus can quickly multiply and progress to AIDS.
Right. Leading to serious health complications and even death.
So this wasn't just like a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was literally a matter of life and death for many people.
Absolutely. And on a global level, interrupting treatment allows the virus to continue spreading and potentially mutating, making it more difficult to treat with existing drugs. So it's a step backward in the fight against HIV just when we've made such significant progress.
It's alarming to think that political decisions could jeopardize the health and well-being of millions of people worldwide. So where does PEPFAR stand now? The 90-day review period is over, but what does the future hold for this vital program?
Well, that's the big question. The 90-day review might be over, but the program is up for reauthorization again in March of 2025, and the political landscape is even more fraught than before. The incident in Mozambique, the 90-day pause, and the continued criticism from groups like the Heritage Foundation have eroded the once solid bipartisan support for PEPFAR.
So it's got to hang in the balance.
Yeah.
What are we seeing play out in the political arena right now?
Well, we're seeing that waning bipartisan support play out even in seemingly unrelated political events. For example, during the Senate confirmation hearings for Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
President Trump's nominee for health secretary.
Yes. President Trump's nominee for health secretary, Senator Cornyn from Texas, a longtime supporter of PEPFAR, directly questioned Kennedy about his stance on the program.
That's really interesting. Why would Senator Cornyn be concerned about Kennedy's stance on PEPFAR?
Well, Kennedy has a history of promoting conspiracy theories about HIV, including questioning the link between HIV and AIDS. His views on public health are considered controversial, to say the least.
Right.
And this line of questioning from Senator Cornyn highlights just how contentious PEPFAR has become.
Wow. So we've got a program that's proven to be incredibly effective in saving lives, but it's facing an uncertain future due to political maneuvering and ideological clashes. That's a lot to unpack, and it leaves us with a pretty big question. What happens next? We'll delve deeper into that in just a bit. But first, let's take a closer look at some of the individual stories that illustrate the human impact of this program.
Okay.
We'll be right back after a short break.
You know, it's easy to get lost in all the political back and forth, but at the end of the day, we can't forget that behind all these debates are real people.
Right.
Whose lives are directly impacted by PEPFAR's fate.
Yeah, this isn't just some abstract policy discussion happening in a vacuum.
Exactly.
We're talking about real lives at stake.
For millions of people in Africa, PEPFAR isn't about political ideology. It's about having access to medication that keeps them alive, about receiving education that empowers them to protect themselves and their loved ones. It's not political. It's personal.
And it's not just about those directly receiving help from PEPFAR. I mean, what about the healthcare workers on the front lines, the doctors, nurses, community health workers?
Right.
They're the ones seeing the human impact of PEPFAR every day.
They're the ones who witnessed the devastation of this epidemic firsthand. They're the ones who had to tell patients to go home and die before PEPFAR came along. You know, they've seen the despair turn to hope. They've watched as communities ravaged by AIDS started to heal and rebuild.
And now imagine having to tell those same patients that the medication they rely on might disappear, that the progress they fought so hard for could be reversed.
Yeah.
What a devastating message to have to deliver.
It's a heartbreaking scenario, and it goes beyond just Africa. The ripple effects of PEPFAR's potential demise would be felt globally.
Right. We're not just talking about a single program.
No.
We're talking about global health leadership.
Oh.
If a program as successful as PEPFAR is allowed to falter, what message does that send to the rest of the world?
It would be a major blow to our credibility as a leader in global health. It weakens our ability to respond effectively to future pandemics and undermines our commitment to tackling these critical health challenges.
It really highlights that interconnectedness of global health. What happens in one part of the world has consequences everywhere else.
In the case of HIV, those consequences could be especially dire. If the virus is allowed to spread unchecked, it could mutate and develop resistance to existing drugs.
Oh, so we could potentially be facing a new wave of the epidemic one that's even harder to control than the one we've been fighting for decades.
Exactly.
That's a chilling thought.
It's a sobering reminder of what's at stake.
Okay, so we've talked about the impact of PEPFAR, the controversy surrounding it, and the potential consequences of its decline. I want to circle back to some of the specific criticisms that have been raised. Let's talk more about this abstinence-only education requirement.
Okay.
It seems pretty counterintuitive, especially when we're dealing with a complex issue like HIV prevention.
It's definitely a point of contention. Many public health experts argue that abstinence-only education is not only ineffective, but it can actually do more harm than good. Well, by focusing solely on abstinence, these programs often fail to provide young people with comprehensive information about safer sex practices and harm reduction strategies. This leaves them ill-equipped to make informed decisions about their sexual health.
I can see how that could backfire.
Yeah.
It seems like withholding information doesn't make the issue go away. It just makes people less prepared to deal with it.
Exactly. And there's another layer to this, the cultural context. In many parts of the world, cultural norms and societal pressures can make it difficult for young people to abstain from sex. So an abstinence-only approach, particularly one that's tied to funding, can feel insensitive and out of touch with the realities on the ground.
It's very rigid. And it seems like it could inadvertently contribute to the stigma surrounding HIV and sexuality.
Absolutely.
Okay, so what about the ban on needle exchange programs? From what I've read, there's a lot of evidence supporting their effectiveness in reducing HIV transmission.
You're right. There's a mountain of evidence demonstrating that needle exchange programs are incredibly effective at preventing the spread of HIV and other blood-borne infections. These programs operate on the principle of harm reduction, which acknowledges that people are going to engage in risky behavior regardless of whether it's sanctioned or not.
So instead of trying to force people to change their behavior, harm reduction aims to make those behaviors less risky.
Precisely. Needle exchange programs provide clean needles to people who inject drugs, reducing the likelihood of them sharing needles and spreading infection. But the argument against them often boils down to this idea that they're condoning drug use.
It's a little more nuanced than that, though, isn't it?
It is.
It's about meeting people where they are and offering them resources to reduce harm regardless of their choices.
That's the core of harm reduction. And these programs often provide more than just clean needles. They connect people with healthcare services, addiction, treatment, social support, creating a pathway to recovery and a healthier life.
It sounds like a much more pragmatic and compassionate approach than simply saying don't do drugs.
Right.
But it seems like these evidence-based strategies are clashing with certain political ideologies, putting PEPFAR's future in jeopardy. It's frustrating to see a program that's doing so much good being held back by political maneuvering.
It is frustrating.
Yeah.
And it raises the question, what happens next? What can be done to ensure that PEPFAR survives these challenges and continues to save lives?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. What are your thoughts? Is there any reason for optimism?
Well, it's important to remember that PEPFAR still has support from both sides of the aisle.
Okay.
It's not a strictly partisan issue, and there are still many lawmakers who recognize its value and are fighting for its survival.
That's encouraging to hear. So it's not a lost cause.
Not at all. But we need to be realistic. The political landscape has shifted, and it's going to take a concerted effort to ensure that PEPFAR continues to receive the funding and support that it needs.
So what can be done? What can our listeners do to make a difference in this fight? It feels overwhelming, like one person can't possibly make a difference in the face of these complex political issues.
I understand that feeling, but you'd be surprised how much power individuals have when they raise their voices.
So it's about speaking up. But how do we make sure those voices are heard? So it's about speaking up, but how do we make sure those voices are heard?
Well, a great first step is simply staying informed. The more you understand about PEPFAR, about the issues at stake, and the potential consequences of its decline, the better equipped you'll be to advocate for it.
Knowledge is power. So read those articles, dig into the research, and don't be afraid to share what you learned with others.
Exactly. Talk to your friends, your family, your colleagues, anyone who will listen. Spread the word about the incredible work PEPFAR is doing and why its future is so important.
It's about amplifying those voices, making sure that lawmakers understand that this isn't just some abstract policy debate.
Right.
This is about real people's lives.
And don't underestimate the power of contacting your elected officials directly. Let them know that you support PEPFAR and that you expect them to prioritize its reauthorization.
So write those letters, make those phone calls, show up at those town hall meetings.
Exactly.
Make your voice heard.
And if you're looking for ways to get even more involved, there are tons of organizations out there working tirelessly to advocate for PEPFAR and global health. Do some research, find one that resonates with you, and consider donating your time or resources. Every little bit helps.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. I started out thinking this would be another dry policy discussion, but it's turned into something much bigger.
It has.
Much more urgent.
It's a reminder that even the most successful programs can be vulnerable when they become entangled in these political battles.
It makes you wonder if something as impactful as PEPFAR, a program that's undeniably saving millions of lives, could be put at risk because of political maneuvering. What does that say about our ability to tackle other global health challenges?
It's a challenging question, and there are no easy answers. But even amidst all the uncertainty and the political noise, there's reason for hope.
Oh, I'm sensing a but coming.
But there are still people fighting for PEPFAR. There are lawmakers on both sides of the aisle who recognize its value and are committed to its survival. There are organizations and individuals all over the world who are dedicated to ensuring that PEPFAR can continue its life-saving mission.
That's encouraging to hear. It sounds like the fight is far from over.
Not at all. And that's the key takeaway for our listeners. This isn't a time to be passive. This is a time to speak up, to get involved, to make your voice heard. The future of PEPFAR and the lives of millions of people around the world depend on it.
So if we had to boil everything down to one final thought for our listeners today, what would it be?
PEPFAR is a remarkable achievement, a testament to human ingenuity and compassion. It shows us what's possible when we prioritize global health and work together to address these shared challenges. But its future is uncertain, and its survival hinges on our collective action. We cannot afford to let political maneuvering and ideological battles undermine a program that has done so much good in the world.
Well said. And to our listeners, we urge you to join this fight. Stay informed, raise your voices, and let's work together to ensure that PEPFAR can continue its life-saving mission for years to come. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of PEPFAR.